How's it going, everyone? Hope you're having a good day. I have a podcast here with Goyland Williams. It's an old one. It's from 6+ months ago, so it should have been released just like our last one a long time ago. But it's audio only. I hope you enjoy it. If you could subscribe, that would be awesome. I'd very much appreciate that. And I hope you enjoy the episode. I think it's very interesting. We talk about a lot of different issues going on in the world. Hope you enjoy. So, welcome to the podcast, everyone. And we're here with Goyland Williams, a professor of mine that we have had on the podcast before, and we're having him on again. And we're just going to sit here and do what we did last time and just talk about what he's got going on and some interesting things going on in the world today. So, why don't you start with what you got going on right now?
Hi, Jimmy. Once again, thank you for having me on the podcast. Of course, I'm always honored to be here with you and having great dialogue. I've been, working on quite a few projects, particularly with around critical race theory and the rage that it has become across the country, even as all the critics of critical race theory don't have an idea what exactly constitutes critical race theory. So I've been responding to a lot of those and fielding a lot of questions and conversations about that. That recently had me in Texas at my alma mater, Texas State University. Go Bobcats! Giving series of talks about how to teach about race to particularly white people and how to teach that around to kids and children. And that was a fruitful dialogue I had a few weeks ago, as well as doing some recent conversations about my dissertation, in which I'm sort of using a lot of theories and frameworks from critical race theory and performance.
Okay, cool. Well, why don't you describe critical race theory for those that don't really have much of a background in looking at that very closely?
Absolutely. I'll take a nudge at it. So critical race theory emerges from a field of thought that essentially tries to understand how race functions in society and how it is deeply embedded into structures and systems of power, right? So race is not always this sort of visible thing that you always see, but race is also always at work in institutions and structurally. So we try to think about how those things, right, are operating beyond the individual level, right, at a systematic or systemic sort of level. And so critical race theory sort of makes this legal argument, right, that racism is deeply embedded in our society. It's a sort of structural part of our society that is persistent and pervasive everywhere, and it's not about getting rid of the individual races or critiquing individual acts of racism, but really talking about going at the structural level and understanding how it informs, right, our society and how at every level, right, there's, racism, whether that's intended or not, but it's deeply embedded in our structures and systems of power that expands from transatlantic slave trade, as well as to Jim Crow, as well as to our own contemporary moment. And what I think everyone gets sort of wrong about this is that critical race theory is this one school of thought that's all of a sudden been taught in schools, although none of the data supports the fact that it's being taught in schools. And so it's kind of interesting, all these lawmakers that are banning critical race theory which assumes that it was ever being taught in classes by white teachers. And so that's my sort of argument against that, is that we see it in systems of power. And the very fact that you're banning something that doesn't exist by its mere name suggests my argument, right? Proves the argument.
That it's like this single train of thought that it almost seems that people are scared of, that don't understand it.
Right. So I make an argument. I'll say, I have a talk that says, "Who's afraid of critical race theory?" Right, in which I'm sort of, playing the dozens, right, or playing the numbers on particularly on ways that white supremacy seems to suppress the ideas that contest, right, their lived realities and experiences and sometimes their own viewpoints. Oftentimes that runs counter to the truth or to actual empirical data and social scientific data that doesn't support any of the things that they're contending.
I think last time we talked a little bit about how generational wealth kind of played into that, and how from examples you gave me is that like when you were in Texas that your family like was very almost very close, but you said that there wasn't like a ton of wealth to like pass on in comparison to like someone that has parents that like for some reason had like a family home or something. If you want to talk a little bit about that and how that plays into critical race theory.
Absolutely, right? I mean, you think about it, racism oftentimes is maintained through systems of capital or to economic systems, right? Particularly capitalism in this instance, right? To where you decide where you can send your children to school based off of your class, right, privilege or your class status, whereas, you know, the black person down the street has to send their child to that public school, even though we know it's an underperforming school. So it's having these sort of structural, right, advantages that privileges a certain group of people over another group of people who don't have those same choices, right? And so this idea of this word choice, right, becomes this sort of like definition, right, that we sort of fight over, right? And we're seeing that now this idea of choice, as if it's just this laissez-faire or let it be sort of economy, when we realize that that's not what benefits the whole society of let everybody do what they want to do and would do what's in the best interest of the individual, right? This country was not founded on those principles. However, capitalism has always sort of been deeply embedded at the sort of core of this country, which sort of infuses, right, racism and white supremacy, right? You don't have slavery without capitalism, right? You don't even have the notion of race without capitalism. The first enslaved people, right, who were on the colonies particularly, right, racism, slavery, as we know, had been so pervasive not only in the United States, but it had been so pervasive across the world. It wasn't a racism thing. It was more about a class hierarchy.
Exactly.
Right? Wealthy people owned slaves inherently, whether that was in Africa, whether that was in Brazil, whether that was in India, right? It was a caste system.
Same thing with like Italy in the early like Rome days. There were slaves. If your land got conquered, a lot of your people would be enslaved. That's where gladiators and all that came from.
Right. And so the historian Barbara J. Fields has this book called Racecraft. And in this book, Fields talks about how, right, this idea of race, right, and people say, oh, race is a social construction. And then they stop there as if that explains away everything. That means nothing, right?
Exactly.
It's a social construction that has real world implications. And so what Fields says about how race became this sort of over-determining sort of factor is that capitalism, right, it wasn't until like this idea of, right, freedom and unfreedom, right, of who could be property, right?
Exactly.
That we sort of understood, wait, we keep seeing these sort of trends on racialized people or darker people becoming, right, slaves, whereas, right, progressive white people over time, whether that was Italians, Jewish, Germans, right, were no longer fit to be slaves, right? And there was an economic argument being made for those things.
I think that brings up like a very interesting point, because in the early like, yeah, you saw that too. In the earlier stages when everyone was coming to America and slavery was still a thing, like the Irish, the Italians, all these white people were coming over. But as time went on, they seemed to merge into the sense they were almost like seen as more...
as white.
As white, yeah, exactly. And that's like... what I'm
There's
trying
a book,
to...
yeah, there's no... And I'm sorry to
oh, no, you're good.
There's a book, right, called How the Irish Became White.
Exactly.
Right, and part of that was about this sort of idea that if we assimilate enough, right, into the economy, if we assimilate ourselves and become so normalized, right, that we don't stand out, right, you start seeing a sort of dissipation of like Irish-only neighborhoods. They sort of start branching out from themselves.
Exactly.
And New York, you see that oftentimes at work. Where you see, I mean, even though you see a lot of neighborhoods that are centered around ethnicity, you see a lot of Hasidic Jewish neighborhoods, you see a lot of Irish neighborhoods, you see a lot of Russian or Albanian neighborhood, right? Those things, Jamaican and Caribbean neighborhoods, you see those things, but those things are, in certain parts, they're an anomaly, right?
Yeah.
Because it becomes that one, it becomes about keeping wealth in the community, right? About how can we keep sustaining ourselves as an other and keep our sort of identity. But historically, that's not what you see. Historically, what you see is Jewish folk or Irish or Italians quickly became white. And that wasn't by accident that they became white. It was it was about how can we best achieve this American dream and fit within a society that has historically disadvantaged us or has historically, right, caused violence against our communities. And so that's one way that you do that, right? You start fitting in so that you can get these jobs, right?
Yeah.
You lose your accent, right? You see this emphasis in Hispanic communities. You see some of the similar things of teaching kids, right, to speak English only and not, right?
Yeah, and it's just like that assimilation comes through, like, it makes it's almost like they had it easier because of their skin color. And that's like where I never really thought about it this way, is that like we all kind of started, not all of us, but the ones that weren't in the white capitalist like system started off almost in the same spot, but it's where our skin tone came in that things were easier for others through generations to come into this, become quote unquote white, you know? And so it kind of like plays back to this almost, we're all from almost the sort of same starting point, if that's appropriate to say. But then that's where it branches off into inequality even more, because African American people don't have the same skin color. So it's like they didn't have the chance to even become seen as in that assimilation.
Right. And Jimmy, I think you bring up an interesting point particularly about that. And I think we're talking about this concept called colorism, right? So colorism is this idea that, right, the darker you are, usually you're connected to black, and that's usually a negative sort of thing. Or the lighter you are, which means you have a closer relationality to whiteness, and thus you have sort of
that assimilation
higher, right, on the sort of hierarchy or being privileged, right? And that happens within communities themselves, right? So that's inter-ethnic, right, as well, right? So within black communities, you have a privileging of lighter-skinned black folks within black communities, and a sort of demonization almost, or fetishization, right, of sort of darker-skinned people. And there's usually, structural critiques and analysis that suggests, right, that darker-skinned folk are usually inherently linked to sort of crime and deviance in ways that fairer-skinned folk are not always done that way. So I'm saying that to say this happens across sort of ethnicities, right? With the Irish, you see that happening within Asian communities. Colorism is a huge thing, right? You see skin bleaching that consistently sort of happens because you don't want to be black. Whatever you are, don't be black, right? And so that message, of course, across time, that hammers in, right? And so you're conditioned, right, to understand those things, and then those things go on to have real implications because people act on those things, right? So it's not saying, oh, well, you're dark and I'm light, so I'm more beautiful. No, it doesn't stop there, right? You're saying you're dark, you're light, you're a bad person, I'm a good person. I should have access to these things because I'm pretty and I'm light. And then, of course, that has implications for not only, right, race, right, and ethnicity, but it has implications for capitalism or for your opportunities on the job, right, fair, right? Whereas, thicker hair, right, crinkly, rough hair black folks, woolly hair black people are oftentimes thought to be unemployable in ways that straight hair is not sort of critiqued in those types of ways, right? So you want to be the blonde-haired girl. You want to be straight and long hair. You don't ever want to have natural or authentic or big afro type of hair. That was a no-no, in black communities for a long time. Of course, Black Power movement, you sort of see a sort of pushback against those things that I'm black and I'm beautiful and I'm natural, right? And I think you're seeing that sort of wave sort of come back. I mean, I'm doing it myself, but right, you see this sort of appreciation for natural hair again in ways that you did not see that before in the 80s and the 90s. That was a no-no. You wanted to be respectable. You wanted to fit in. You didn't want to stand out in those types of ways.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that we're seeing now, especially with larger media companies helping towards where they should be. There's a show on ABC called Soul of a Nation. I don't know if you've seen it. That is solely run to inform people of things that have been overlooked and that were, like you were saying, no-nos back in the 90s and 80s and 90s. I think that's a lot for representation that hasn't been done until recently. And I think media being as big as it is with social media and then just big movies in Hollywood and everything, and even Netflix shows, are really trying to play their part more so now than before with representation.
Absolutely. And Jimmy, I must say that I'm still wary of all of these sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts because, a lot of it is performative, and I hate to use the word performative in this way, and let me clarify what I mean when I say that, right? A lot of it is very much about how can we financially benefit from this and not how can we be good people and structurally change our relationship to black people, right? It's not that. If that was what it was, I would be fine with it, but oftentimes it stops at the level of representation, right? So representation says, well, we have a black person, we have a queer person, we have a trans person, we have a Latino person, we have Asian folk in our faculty and our student population. We've done our jobs. Mm-hmm. There's nothing else we need to do, right? We've hired all these people, right? So representation only gets you that level, right? Mm-hmm. What representation doesn't oftentimes account for is the sort of structural pervasiveness of whiteness, even when you have faces of color, right? So it says, oh, well, I have a black face. We don't have to think about other efforts to be more inclusive to black students, right? So, we have one black faculty, and that person becomes the whole representative of black experience, and it stops there. Or, we have two Asian Americanists, and it stops there, right? It doesn't show that there's diversity even amongst black people. I don't think in the same ways that, right, conservative black folk like a Clarence Thomas might think. I don't think the same way, right, as a lot of other, right, black thinkers and individuals. And so it suggests this sort of homogenous conceptualization of black experiences or of other ethnic experiences.
I think you're hitting on a really true note there. I agree completely. It's almost like they're just trying to meet a quota.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna. Yes and no. I'm not going to always say they're trying to meet this quota, but I am going to try to say they're trying to cater to a demand. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a demand, rightfully so. There's a demand to include people who institutions have historically excluded intentionally. Right, and so there's a demand, right, that has started, particularly with, the Black Lives Matter movement, right, with the and with other sort of concomitant movements that are sort of in relationship to that have demanded that institutions change their relationship to historically marginalized and vulnerable populations. And so this is sort of an outgrowth, I think, of those efforts that has been, 5-6 years in the works, and we're finally seeing that on different job markets, different corporations. Mm-hmm. But similar to sort of Pride, once Pride Month is over, the flags go back down, and you see a proliferation of hate, and no one speaks about it because we had Pride Month, right? We show representation, mm-hmm. right? But it becomes a corporatization of this sort of representation. We start selling this, right? You mm-hmm. see Target and other companies selling products that particularly cater to these demographics, and then no actual structural analysis, no actual structural change that happens as a result. So oftentimes, again, you're seeing the conflict between, right, capitalism and structural racism. There's mm-hmm. a deep connection there. So it's not coincidental when you see these things that capitalism drives, right, our sort of efforts, drives our mm-hmm. diversity efforts, and I'm so against it. So I'm so sick of some of these diversity and inclusion efforts for this very reason, that without this sort of financial incentive, these organizations would not be doing them. Without public pressure, they would not be doing them.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those good, bad things. I'm sort of looking at it in that sort of, way. So I'm
critical.
I'm a critical pessimist. I'm always sort of critiquing and sort of knowing the underside of efforts that even might benefit me in the short term. I know that at night, though the clock quickly will change, right? And what used to benefit me or what used to be catered to me will no longer serve my interests or needs or of people of color in general. So,
yeah. So that brings an interesting question to kind of, how do you think, and I don't even know how to phrase this because I have no idea, but it almost raises the question of how to go about making a change for the long term, like in a doable fashion that isn't seen as, not even hasn't seen, but actually in good faith.
Well, Jimmy, I think I would be getting paid a lot of money if I had the answers to
That's true.
to structural racism. That's the part of it. It's so embedded that it makes no sense, and a lot of times efforts to even change is so, you grow weary, right? Because it's like it's so much to change and you don't know where to begin. But I'd say, I gesture towards saying that to be committed to transformation means to be committed to honest and intense dialogue across difference. I think to be committed to transformation and change means to fundamentally question your own dogmas and presuppositions in your own belief systems and how you interact and engage with people who don't look and think like you. It means decolonizing, right? This word, decolonizing your mind and your heart and your commitments, financial, right? Your sort of interpersonal commitments, who you are in relationship with and why and under what conditions. So I think it means this sort of radical interrogation of deeply held beliefs. And sort of, so when people say give up your privilege, that's what I think that means, right? Recognizing your power, right, in that privilege, right? And recognizing that you have power as a particular being, as a particular socialized and racialized or non-racialized being, right? As a white male, you have certain advantages that I don't have and might not necessarily have. And that's not to suggest that I'm a victim in any way. Because that's not the truth. I don't see myself that way. But it is to suggest that you have a particular relationship with American society and the American democracy in ways that I have never had or don't have the advantage of having. And so I think, and it's hard, right? Because it's hard to ask somebody to give up assumptions and suppositions and dogmas, right, and belief systems that have been at your core of your family for hundreds of years. And then to move to the next level and say to give up your privilege and your financial gain, right? That's a whole nother basket, and I don't know if a lot of people are usually not willing to engage you at that point where you're asking somebody to give up their wealth or their relationship to capitalism. So.
Yeah, I think I love that you said that. I don't exactly remember the wording you had, but giving up that, becoming more open-minded. I think we can kind of describe to people how we can become more open-minded, and by saying that when we're talking about privilege, there's this negative connotation that goes along with it that turns people off from even becoming open-minded to it. So you say that I have privilege, and I automatically am like, what
do you mean? Right.
What do you mean? And it shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. You have to accept that is how it is, and you can let go of that eventually and understand. It's more about understanding where someone in your standing from someone my standing has in society, and understanding what that lends to you and what that lends to me. And we gotta work to open people's minds so that they realize this and not see it as a negative thing that people are talking about, so they don't just discount it.
Right, and I think the conversation about privilege has been skewed by both sides, to be quite frank with you. Again, I go back to this word power. I often try to use power instead of privilege because, I think I have certain power. Like, for example, and I'm an educator, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. I have power in the classroom over students, right, in ways that they don't have over me. Even considering my black queerness, right, or my blackness particularly, right, I have a structural advantage giving these I have a power dynamic particularly. I have the power over grades, right? That's a particular relationship with the student that I have, even consider that they might be white and historically have all these economic advantages over me that I don't have, right? So I like to say there's particular power relationships that we have that are persistent and that happens at any given moment. They can flip, right? So I might have a particular power dynamic with the student on the basis of, education, right, or employment status, right? Whereas they might have particular power or privilege over me in terms of like economics or racial privilege, right? Or gender, right? So those things sort of flip. It's not a static notion, but it's something that you're always subjected to, and it's something that you're always sort of complicit in, and something that you're sort of harmed by, right? So it's not you're an absolute victim or you're an absolute perpetrator. I don't believe in those things, right? I think that it's a continuum that you're always sort of like navigating, balancing out. And so I think when people understand that sort of dynamic and we teach it in that sort of way, I think you might receive sort of less negative sort of connotations with this idea of privilege, because privilege awakens the anger in people when they, especially if you're a white person who is lower middle class and you're like, what privilege do I have? I have debt, I have kids, I have all these, right? You don't see yourself as having this particular privilege that everyone is ascribing to whiteness.
Exactly.
Right. And so this angst or this anxiety causes this sort of rage up in you that you're like, well, where is it? I don't have it. My family did, right? So this is this sort of quest to become innocent, or this quest to frame somebody as an absolute nightmare, right? And I don't think either of those are true. I don't think either of those are true, but I think we're always in relationship somewhere on that continuum at any given encounter that we might have with somebody who looks different or thinks different or comes from different places and spaces than we might. So I think that might be a gesture or a nod towards where we might begin if we want to talk about transformation and reorienting our minds and our relationship to white supremacy and capitalism in general.
And just kind of coming, I think it's just like people got to open their minds, man. Everyone's so married to their ideas, and that's like where you're coming at. It's just like if we can open our minds to this spectrum that we need to balance out, then we can start talking about and making a change. It doesn't need to be this either overly positive thing or overly negative thing. If we can come to that middle ground, we can really start to make change, and that's where we have a lot of discourse in terms of people just not wanting to have a conversation at all. And the biggest thing to have is a conversation, because we're not going to get anywhere if we're just married to our ideas and just stick to them.
Right, because these conversations are typically very polarizing.
Exactly.
And they induce a lot of anxiety in people, and they rile people up, because we're used to the extremes. We're not used to having honest and critical dialogue that tells us, hey, you might end up right in the middle somewhere if you're honest with yourself about your own relationship, not only to yourself, but your own relationship to your community, right?
Exactly.
So and I think we oftentimes think of these big analyses or these big transformation. I don't think that way. I think of how can I change my relationship today in the communities that I live and labor in. Right? How can I be freer? How can I free other people? How can I change, how I present myself in certain ways, or who am I welcoming into my community? Who am I excluding from my community, and why? Right? So I think it's something as simple as that. Start where you are, right? Because if you think oftentimes at this big structural deep level, you're never going to be able to start change, because you're going to say that's too big. I have to do all these things. No, it starts at home, So I think that's a sort of different way. And in my own research, I think about, performance and embodiment a lot from the sort of personal. And then I use the personal as a lens to talk about the political, because the personal, of course, is political, but I use the interpersonal, the small sort of everyday experiences to talk about something much bigger. Because I think when you start with what you know and with what you experience, you begin to understand something that you don't know and something that you don't experience. And so it's from the inside out that I work, and I think oftentimes people start from the outside in, and that's when
it gets way too jumbled up for you to even handle.
It gets jumbled, and the debate gets muddled. Terms gets thrown out there that you have never understood and never used, and all of a sudden, here we come with this, these critiques against critical race theory, and saying we're banning something that we never even understood and never even taught and never read a book about. So,
yeah, I think it's like going from the inside out. That gives you terms to also relate to someone that might not completely understand. And if you can get someone to relate to something, and that gives them a pathway to see and almost become not enlightened, because that's saying that, like, enlightened's a heavy word to use, but make them have an understanding of your situation. And I think it just goes to this, I don't know if you agree with me, but it's just this getting people to understand and not having a positive or a negative view on it, but just being open-minded to new ideas and seeing people for who they are as a person rather than what it is they look like or how they view people in a romantic sense. There's no reason to have that have anything to do with their who they are as on the inside and as a person,
Yeah, I think that you're right, but getting people to be open to new ideas, that's the work, because oftentimes we think we're open to new ideas and we're not, right? So one thing we know that theory teaches us, and empirical data supports this, is that, if you're committed to a belief system, oftentimes, even when counteracted, right, with counter evidence, you're going to hold on to your belief even more intensely. You're going to start researching, right, evidence and finding evidence to support your argument and your position that you've always sort of held, right? We keep seeing this now, right, with the sort of debates about the vaccines and things, right? We keep seeing this, right, even when they've presented with counter evidence and saying, hey, mask wearing prevents exposure to COVID, or, doing this prevents these, the Delta variant, or lowers the risk of it, right? People that are refusing, vaccines for whatever reason, right, they're going to say, oh, well, I've researched the vaccine. And what research have you done? You're not a scientist. You're not a researcher, right? And so people go find evidence, these sort of constructed conspiracies, and they go find these blogs that give these very thorough and detailed analysis that seems to make sense. It registers with their experience, right? So it seems reasonable. It seems well-researched. And so guess what? They're like, look, I found this. See, the vaccine is causing all these weird characteristics and traits. And, then you come up with all these sort of conspiracy theories and arguments for why these things happen. So it's a tall task, I think, to confront some of these things because, as we know, knowledge doesn't happen in a vacuum. And we know that, knowledge is context bound and it's loaded and it's political, So when people, think that you can teach or that you can research from an apolitical point, I kind of laugh, right? Because everything you do is politically bound, right? You're in a political situation, and you're always, right? I think the communication situation, it's always a sort of political context in which you're speaking in. That you have to, right, acknowledge. Whether you acknowledge it or not, it's there, right? And so I think those types of things prevent a lot of dialogue from happening, right, or honest dialogue, because we're all starting from different points and different experiences. And you're saying, well, my data shows this, and then, if I'm a conservative, I'm going to go watch Fox News, and I'm going to find a whole nother data set that, right, contests what you just told me, and both think they're right. Right? And the moment you think you're right, there's no help for you.
Yeah.
You're not open. You have literally shut down. You have epistemically closed off any engagement with anybody else that sounds different or thinks different from you. Right? And I think that's the scariest thing. I don't care what side you're on. I think that's the most scariest and dangerous thing you can ever do. Oftentimes I'm friends with a lot of people, or follow a lot of people on Twitter that I don't agree with at all. Patently disagree with, but I think they're great people still. You know what I mean? And so I want to listen to hear what they're talking about, even though I know I would, and I'm not going to engage you. I'm not going to go and find counterpoints because I don't think that's helpful or useful in a setting like Twitter or Facebook. That's because then you're trying to win. Yeah. You're trying to win an argument, and the moment you're interested in winning an argument, you're not open to transformation or change.
No, not at all.
You're trying to be right. And when you're trying to be right, you have a fight. You have a dog in the fight. And
And
you've detached yourself from humanity at that point.
yeah, and you destroyed all those bridges.
Right, and those bridges are gone.
Yeah.
And so I'm very believe in intimate settings. I believe in casual conversations, with people who I don't think like.
Exactly.
Because I think that's where learning happens. I think that's where transformation happens. Because you'll find yourself that somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. I think most people are there too, and people always want to say they're in the middle, and I think 90% of people are.
Right. Oh yeah. People don't want. They want to choose a side, and it's about being historically right or being on the right side of history. And so nobody wants to take the neutral or the middle road. Everyone wants to be on this side or this side, and there's no common ground. And so as a result, that makes language difficult.
Yeah.
Right. That makes ideas difficult. That makes truth. Right. What is truth? Right. That makes that idea so unreachable, unattainable at times, because there is none of that sort of middle ground. There is all of these sort of competing ideas and no way to mitigate that.
Yeah.
And nothing that, right, brings those things together. And so as an educator, one of my goals, or what I always do in the classroom is, I have students, two sets of students, one set of students read this article, the other set read this article, and then, I bring the synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying, hey, there might be talking about two different topics or the same topic from two different angles, right? Both can be true. There are features in each one of these articles, right, that are staunchly true, right, to a particular set of experiences, to a particular group of people, right? How do we sort of mitigate that? How do we bring these ideas together? What combines them? What unites them? Rather than what separates and what tears them down. So that's sort of my own this sort of vicious debate stuff has propelled my own sort of pedagogy, right, of teaching philosophy on how I try to combat that in a small space such as a classroom with a small set of students. I think it begins with 15 and 20 students at a time.
I think you're right. I think you're very right. And I think that moves towards our next, I know there's a few points we want to hit on. We got about 20 minutes here. So I think that if we bring that into the lens of looking at where we were talking about structural racism, and a lot of people don't want to believe that wherever they may be on the spectrum of racism and believing it or not, they don't want to believe that it's in today's society, even though it might not be blatant, like, individualist, like, coming at each other. It's this built into the system in many ways from before, like you were saying, in terms of the war on drugs, which we talked about last time. There's literally tapes saying that is meant to suppress the minorities.
Yeah. And you see it also, I thought recently, there was a recent story, I don't know if you saw it, Amherst College recently suspended legacy admissions policies, as of yesterday, I believe, and committed $71 million to financial aid for, students there attending there. And so what that means is legacy admissions has historically privileged wealthy people, right? So think about who's historically has went to Amherst College. Wealthy white parents that could afford, and grandparents that could afford to pay for their child, or grandchild or niece or nephew to go to this top-notch liberal arts school, but that costs so much. And Amherst College suspended that. I'm sure that's going to cause quite an uproar, right? Whereas several schools across the country have such policies. I'm from Texas, and Texas A&M and UT Austin, those are the biggest schools, and everyone wants to go, and not everybody can get in. And so they have, I know A&M particularly has legacy admissions policies. I'm sure UT Austin had them as well, which means if your parent went there, your grandparent went there, or someone in your family went to school there, you're almost guaranteed a spot.
And that's your...
And then so that's not even about your accomplishments. And that's not to say you're a bad student or you were a bad student or that you're not a good student. That's not to say that, but it is to say that to be given an extra priority simply by the fact that someone in your family had a particular name, or someone in your family has a history with that institution, that you're guaranteed admissions over someone who might have better performance than you,
Exactly.
but don't have any sort of power like that, or networks, right? So remember, we talked about the sort of idea of networks. That's how racism becomes entrenched, right? Is that you have a particular network that has historically had these advantages because one, usually about exploiting other people, vulnerable people, but usually that privileges a wealthy class of people and excludes everyday people from having access to those institutions, even though they're very qualified and deserving of those things, right? So you have to have the fact that you have to have these type of policies to counteract that, right? Or you have to have affirmative action policies to counteract these sort of legacy admissions. That's what legacy admissions are. They're affirmative action.
Exactly.
Right? And we don't talk about those things in those types of ways. But when it benefits black and brown folk, right, that's when it becomes a issue, a bad thing. Right? Oh, we don't want affirmative action policies. It allows unqualified students, which none of the data supports that these kids are unqualified. Actually, they're usually more high performing. They've just been overlooked because they don't have those. They didn't go to the fancy schools. They don't have great guidance counselors. They don't. Yeah, and so those things are usually historically have been benefited, right, wealthy or well-to-do sort of white folk in particular. And so you're seeing that sort of backlash against that, and people get in an uproar. You get personal when that happens.
I can 100% understand that and agree with you. It goes to that networking that it comes to this odd point where people don't realize that, say I'm white and I have a cousin that worked here for so long and it gets me a job opportunity somewhere. And that's where this entrenchment comes from. Whereas if you're an African American and didn't have anyone in the company and you're trying to get a job in the company, you don't have an in. Even if they're not looking at the color of your skin or whatever, what people want to say it is, you don't have that in to somewhere, or you don't have this or that. And that's where this like systematic stuff comes. Even though it doesn't seem as though, hey, I'm saying, oh, I'm privileged because of this. It's something you don't realize.
Right. It's so pervasive and so common sense, right? So this sort of idea that Dr. Ursula Orr and Matthew Howdick, these are communication scholars, they call it the common sense of racism, right? It makes so much sense that it's so normalized, right? For example, where we know that personal networks and job opportunities are closely related, right? Most likely, if you know somebody, you're going to get the job usually. I had a friend literally tell me about, a candidate that they hired at their job, and everybody was against this candidate because they were not qualified, but they went to a really nice school, and the owner was vetting for this person, even though everyone else did not want the person, and they were not qualified to be an engineer, and so that person got in, and it seems like there was a strong connection that he probably knew that kid, right, or knew the parents of that child, and owed him a job, right? So those types of networks. How are your networks proliferating, white supremacy, right? Because when we think about it, and it becomes white supremacy when, one, all of your networks are white, all of your networks look like you and think like you, and they don't open space and hold space for people that are different. And that don't have this access. So my thing is always, how can you broaden the reach? How can you expand your community and allow in voices that otherwise would not have those types of things? And I think, all of our roles is to make other people more freer, and to truly transform a society is really to open up yourself and open up, people to having some of the same things that you benefit from. That's what it means to give up your privilege. It doesn't mean you literally have to surrender everything that your family has worked for, earned, or whatever, or passed down to you. But it does mean, well, how can you include other people in this success?
Exactly.
Right? Because if we think community-minded, right, and I tend to do that, if we think community-minded, that's where transformation begins, right? Then you start seeing, all my friends are not white, right? Oh, right. This kid that works so hard, but his family doesn't have the resources. I'm going to share with him, right? Or I'm going to share with her. Or I'm going to share with them, right? Those types of things begin to really make structural changes because you're opening up the benefits
to
that
everyone.
you've enjoyed. To everyone, right?
Exactly.
Or to people that you're associated with. So that's where we start talking about structural racism and structural privileges, is how those things are proliferated because it becomes so normalized. And nobody questions that Jimmy got the job because his uncle knew the owner. No one questions that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
That's almost expected to get, a lot of places brag about, oh, you can't, be in the National Guard or the Coast, right, or the Navy or something without having a letter from a senator or things like that. Who would have access to a senator unless you're wealthy?
Exactly.
Unless you're in those
Unless
circles.
you're backing them at like a campaign or something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's how ludicrous it is, right? And it tells you like that racism makes no sense. White supremacy makes no. It's crazy. It's pure insanity.
Mm-hmm.
And no one or very few people, right, tend to see that, when you're enjoying the benefits of that. It's hard to see your own sanity or insanity. You can't define yourself in those types of ways.
Yeah, and just to go, that kind of goes back to the opening people's minds, because what we just said could sound, how would we put this? It could sound negatively going towards people getting jobs because they know someone. We're not saying that's bad, but we're saying we need to include everyone in that spectrum. In terms of, say I get a job somewhere because I have someone that works there. Maybe I have a friend down the line that's trying to get a job there too, and they are not white. They don't look like me. Me lending that hand out and putting my name in for them is sharing that, and that's moving towards change.
Or to consider, to saying, hey, well, I know I got this opportunity because somebody looked out for me. I'm going to go look out for somebody else who otherwise would not get here.
Exactly. And I think that's the positive, open-minded look on it. Whereas if we take it and just say that and don't explain that this is actually a positive thing, we're pointing out that these are good things that people have, but we need to make it so it's not just a white person has this. We need to make it so that we're looking out for everyone.
Or we're just, being very honest about the chances that people have, right? Because oftentimes these positions, will broadcast jobs and positions as if anyone can get the position if you're qualified, and we know that's not the truth. I've personally benefited from jobs where I've known somebody. I would like to think that I'm very qualified for the position, in some ways overqualified, but right, so it doesn't just mean only white people benefit from this. I would never say that. I think that's ridiculous, right? Which again, I'm talking about power, right? When I say power, we all have power in different capacities. We all have networks. What those networks can do for us vary, right? Depending on, where we are on that continuum. I just think it means being honest about what we're looking for, and if we're going to say we're committed to change and we're not racist, you need to show that. You don't need to tell me that. I need to see it in your actions. Your actions need to reflect that you're committed to transformation, that you're committed to anti-racism. That's an active thing. That's an active verb. That's an action. That's not something that you passively say, well, I'm not being racist, so I'm anti-racist. That's not how that works, right? Anti-racism, just like racism, is a doing, right? It's a doing. It's an action, right? You have to undo, right? Because we're going to, right, racism is so pernicious that you have to assume that it's already there. So you have to actively work to undo those types of things. So you have to do something. And a lot of people, are passive, like, well, I'm not intentional. I'm not being racist, so there's no racism, right? And we know that unfortunately that's not the truth. Yeah. So I think that's a good conversation. I think that's where we can pick up off of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I think we hit on a lot of great points. I know we wanted to talk about, if you want to quickly talk about, what was his name? If you'd like to refresh my memory.
Oh, Kyrie Irving?
Yes.
Well, I was thinking about that, but I think, for the sake of time, that we probably can just drop it, and maybe we'll pick that up for the next
one,
for the next episode. Yeah, because I'm thinking a lot in my research agenda, and the way I'll hint at it. My research agenda, particularly now, I'm looking at the rhetoric of like anti-vaccine, the anti-vax people across race and gender, and particularly at sort of looking at athletes, professional athletes, or college athletes and coaches. You're seeing a range of these people sort of refuse the vaccine for for religious reasons, personal reasons, and this sort of rhetoric that they're all using of personal choice, and how that's seemingly innocent, but it has deep sort of political and a historical sort of legacy that I'd be interested in taking up. So I'm looking at that in my next research project that I'm working on right now. And so maybe in our next conversation, we can, after I've actually done the research, that we can pick up this conversation and go forward with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, look forward to the next podcast. And I'm looking forward to having you on again. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think we made some very clear, good points that people needed to hear, just because I think there's just this gridlock of people just being closed and married to their ideas, where they don't want to open their mind to this transformation not being a negative thing. Because people just think it's like we're trying to take away random things. And it's just like, no, we just want everyone to benefit. And for it to be on a level where we can all just understand each other, because like, given our different experiences and everything and where we come from, we're all human. We're all moving through the universe,
Yeah, we're all fallible beings, right? And we're all gonna die. And somewhere in between there, you gotta hopefully change and be open to the idea that to be a good human being, to be a better human being, is that you have to change beliefs that are outdated or that no longer serve you, and that no longer serve the broader community and the vision that we have for justice. And if you say you're committed to justice and freedom for everybody, that means expanding and transforming and renewing your mind and ideas. So I think that's a great start.
Awesome. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you guys liked it. Throw stuff down in the comments, and I'll look forward to talking to you guys next time. Thank you again. Very much appreciated for Hartford University for lending us the studio for the day to have a little conversation. And hope everyone has a good day. Thank you, Goyland.
Thank you, Jimmy.